Our next speaker is Maya Kobersy. She is an Associate General Counsel at the University of Michigan. She works in several key areas, including affirmative action and diversity, election law, privacy, research and research misconduct, and university logo issues. She's the Office of General Counsel Liaison to the Institutional Review Board for Health Sciences and Behavioral Sciences. She'll give her presentation, and then she'll ask some questions, and you may think about things that you're doing in your areas and your units or things that you're thinking about doing. Maya Kobersy, thank you.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me here today. I have the unenviable task of talking with you while you're trying to eat your lunch about the law, which is the most scintillating topic, even for lawyers, I'll admit. And in the midst of some very dynamic speakers here today, but I hope that you'll find this informative, and I hope that we can engage in some dialogue at the end about some of the questions that you might have as you are preparing your different diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plans. So what I was asked to talk about today are the legal parameters for those plans that you all will be developing. You should have in your materials, not here today, but back at your units, a guidance document that we put together that talks about various kinds of diversity factors and the legal parameters that apply to the use of each of those factors in a variety of settings. What I'm going to do today is focus just on 3 factors that are covered by Proposal 2, which was passed by the voters of Michigan back in 2006. So Proposal 2 in particular addresses discrimination and preferential treatment on the basis of race, ethnicity, and sex. It also applies to those factors, to those actions, discrimination and preferential treatment in the context of national origin and color, but I'm just going to focus on race, ethnicity, and sex today. What I wanted to stress is that what is legally compliant with respect to a particular topic will depend on which factor you're looking at, and which diversity factor you're looking at, and which context you're thinking about. So again, that legal parameters document will go into a lot more detail about a lot of other diversity factors like political perspective, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, a lot of other factors in these contexts, but I'm just going to focus on these particular factors. And one thing that I think is really key to stress and to remember as you guys go forth in writing your plans is that we can seek diversity across any factor that we want. Any diversity factor is permissible for us to consider and for us to value diversity, equity, and inclusion with respect to that factor. But what we have to do is think about what can we do legally to try to achieve that diversity. And so what I want to stress also is that I'm not going to be able today, or even in that legal parameters document, to go through every possible scenario that you might be facing, or every possible idea that you all might brainstorm as you work to develop your diversity strategic plans and trying to come up with innovative ways to achieve diversity, promote equity, and build inclusive communities. So if that should happen, I want you to feel free to come to me, to come to the General Counsel's office, to talk about those ideas that you're having, to see whether there's a way for us to achieve what it is that you're trying to achieve. It may be in some cases that the idea that you come up with is something that we just hadn't considered or seen before, but it's completely fine. It may be that the idea that you've come up with is something that we've looked at in the past and it's been problematic, but we've figured out another way to try to achieve that same end. And so we can talk about how we can reframe your idea a little bit to try to achieve that goal in a manner that is legally compliant. And it may be something that you've come up with that we just haven't looked at before. It could be risky, but we have some ideas about what we might want to do, and so we might have to talk it through and think if there's a way that we can change our thinking and move our thinking forward in that particular area. So just because you don't see something addressed in the parameters document, or just because what I say today seems to be going along one particular trajectory, it doesn't mean that you should be thinking to yourself that that's it, everything is set in stone. I think this kind of goes along with the point that Dean Runge made at the beginning when he said that at the end of the day today we might have some directions, but we won't necessarily have the full roadmap. And so we may need to stop at some points and figure out that the road was closed in a particular way and we need to find a new route, but that's something that we can do together. So I I thought I would start with a brief overview of Prop 2 for those of you who maybe weren't at U of M or in the state of Michigan back in 2006 when it first passed. So it was passed by the voters of the state, and it applies very explicitly to the University of Michigan, to Michigan State University, and Wayne State University, where actually the three institutions are called out in the first section of the proposal. And it also applies to the state and other public institutions more broadly. As I noted before, Prop 2 prohibits preferential treatment to or discrimination against any person or group on the basis of race, ethnicity, sex, color, or national origin in the operation of public education, public employment, and public contracting. And it has been upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. So for those of you who had maybe been watching that case law and comparing it with the Grutter and Gratz decisions that came out involving the University of Michigan back in 2003, the Supreme Court has said it's okay for the state to adopt a more restrictive view of what can and can't be done in the realms of race, ethnicity, and sex. The challenging thing about Prop 2, or one of the challenging things about Prop 2, is that none of the terms in the proposal are defined. So the only term actually in the proposal that's defined is the term state. But we don't really need to worry about what the term state means because, as I said, U of M, MSU, and Wayne State were specifically called out, so we know that the term state applies to us. But what we don't know is, what does it mean to grant preferential treatment to somebody? What does it mean to discriminate? There's case law on discrimination, but there isn't really case law on preferential treatment, except in the context of two states that had adopted Prop 2-like ballot initiatives before the state of Michigan did. And the interesting thing about that is those two states had very different experiences after their voters adopted those proposals in terms of what the courts thought would still be permissible and what the courts thought would not still be permissible. So here in the state of Michigan, we really are just each one of us, each institution is sort of figuring out for itself what we think Prop 2 means, what we can do, what we can't do. And so what I'm going to share with you is what we at U of M currently think, based on the law as it currently stands and the interpretations that we've seen in some of these other states, what we think this means for us here at the university. And as I noted, if there are developments or ideas that you all come up with, or if there are changes in the law going forward, if there's a new Attorney General opinion or a new case that comes out that could help shed light on this, then that would be an opportunity for us to reevaluate our parameters and make new determinations. So the first area that I was going to talk about is admissions. So I'm going to start with things that we can do in admissions. So one of the things that we can still do is ask people to identify their race, their ethnicity, and their sex on their applications. You may also, this I know is going beyond what I said I was going to talk about, you may also have seen from one of the stories that we heard earlier, a question about sexual orientation and why aren't we asking about that? They were talking about that in the context of patient intake forms, but it could apply in the context of applications, and I know there are some units here on campus that have begun to include questions about that on the application. It's important for us to be clear that those questions are all optional. We can't force anyone to have to answer and provide that information to us. But we are required, for example, under federal law, to ask about race and ethnicity, and to do that in a very specific way on our applications. So you may have noticed that all the med school applications, for example, had changed to a 2-question format, asking first about ethnicity, if anyone identifies as Hispanic, and then asking about the racial identification. Again, these are optional questions, but we can ask them. We can also state in our diversity strategic plans, or just in our materials generally, we can talk about how we remain committed to diversity and that we seek a critical mass of students of all backgrounds, including of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and of any gender identity. And we can try to achieve that critical mass of student body diversity through consideration of factors such as the ones that I've listed on this slide, like commitment to diversity or social justice, attendance at particular high schools or at a historically black college or university or other minority serving institution. We can look at descriptor plus segments, which is something that the College Board does, where they identify different neighborhoods and different high schools by geodemographic factors. And so we can say, like, that we can see that there's underrepresentation of certain of those segments or clusters here at the university, and we can try to achieve greater representation of those clusters and those neighborhoods. We can also look at whether a student has participated or an applicant has participated in one of our pipeline programs. So a lot of times when we think about how we're going to be evaluating someone, we know that we're supposed to be using an individualized and holistic approach. We know that we're supposed to be looking at the whole candidate. But what we sometimes don't pay attention to is the fact that we might know more about a particular applicant because they're someone who has shown their interest in U of M from an early age. They've come here regularly for programs over the summer. They've done well in those programs. And so when you're going through and you're looking at the application of someone, maybe you see two people who have the same kinds of test scores or the same kinds of grades, and yet one of them has been participating in our program since they were in middle school. Why isn't that something that we can look at and account for favorably when we're evaluating those two candidates? Why can't we say to ourselves, we know that this person is someone who can succeed here because they've already succeeded here? So that's something else that we can do. Another thing that we can do is not really about the decision to offer admission, but to encourage admitted students to actually accept our offers once we've made them. So this is one time where I'm actually going to talk about explicitly considering race and ethnicity or gender or other factors in making your decisions about call-outs. So for example, you've made offers of admission, or Stephen has made offers of admission to, let's say, 3,000 applicants. That's a huge number, but Stephen was feeling really excited. He made offers to 3,000 candidates. He's not sure who's going to wind up coming. But let's just be honest, if Stephen did that and every single one of those people said they were going to accept, he didn't really do it. I just want to be clear. He didn't really do that. But if he had done that, and every single one of those 3,000 people had accepted his offer of admission, we would then need to be able to find spaces for those people, right? We're held to that. We've offered them admission. As long as they accept the offer within the designated time period, we have to honor that offer. But what we can do is try to encourage people to accept that offer, and we can make our decisions about whom to encourage based on the class that we're trying to create. Because what we're doing there is we're trying to influence their private decision-making, not our state decision-making, right? So we could say among those 3,000 applicants, 200 of them or 3,000 admitted students, 200 of them are underrepresented minorities. And we're going to make phone calls. We're going to have Dean Runge make phone calls. Dr. Gay is going to make phone calls. Individual members of the faculty are going to make phone calls or send emails to say, we saw that you were admitted to U of M, and we really hope that you'll come here for medical school. We really want you to do that. And we can make those determinations based on whatever factor we want. We could say these are the people with the highest MCAT scores. We can say we're going to call the people who are, we're going to call women in particular who've expressed an interest in particular areas of study that we think we have underrepresentation by gender. We can do any of those things. What we can't do, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is give anything to those candidates based on that characteristic. So we can't do a call out that says we're only going to call underrepresented minority admitted students and say, here, we're going to give you an extra $1,000 to come here. Or here are free football tickets for those of you who want them. Or would you like to have an office in the medical school? We have renovated some space in Med-Sci. You can have that space now. We're not going to be doing anything like that. We can't do anything like that, but we can make those calls and those connections to try to encourage people to come. So continuing with things that we can't do, obviously we can't consider race, ethnicity, sex in our admissions decisions in the first place. So we can't say, oh, this person is African American, we want to give them an offer. This person is a woman, we don't have enough women in the profession, we're going to give this person an offer just because of those factors. We also can't set numerical goals. So remember I said we can talk about seeking a critical mass. And I know that seems like wishy-washy and it seems confusing, but sadly that's the only term that the Supreme Court has blessed for us to use in the context of admissions. And we can't, the second you set a number to it in the context of admissions, it becomes what the court would consider to be a quota, and it becomes unlawful. So we can't say we want to have this percentage of African Americans or this percentage of Latino students or whatever without running afoul of the Supreme Court precedent. But as I said, we can talk about achieving a critical mass or of improving our diversity year over year. And as I said before, we can't offer special inducements to those admitted students to encourage them to enroll if we're doing that on the basis of a protected factor like their race or their ethnicity or their sex. Again, there are other ways that we could do it. We could have a program that says we're going to invite all admitted students who had attended these 3 high schools to come to campus for a program. We can do something where it's anyone from those high schools because it's based on the relationship that we have with those schools. It's not based on the demographics of the individual applicant or admitted student. Does that make sense? There will be time for questions at the end as well, but feel free to let me know if going through something is not seeming clear. So the next area I was going to talk about is financial aid. So again, the things that we can do are consider some of the same kinds of factors that I talked about before in terms of trying to improve our diversity. So we can have financial aid programs, U of M funded and U of M administered programs that give people money based on their commitment to diversity or social justice. We can give funding to students who had participated in various pipeline programs here. We can even give funding to students who had participated in particular student organizations here that have diversity or social justice issues as a focus of their mission. Because under our policies, all of our recognized student organizations have to be open without respect to race, ethnicity, national origin, et cetera. They have to comply with our non-discrimination policies, and they can only make distinctions on membership based on the individual's commitment to or disruption of their mission, right? So anyone can choose to be a member of the Black Medical Students Association, whether they're African American or not. They just have to say that they're there to try to support the mission of that association. Another thing that we can do relates to acceptance of money from outside donors. So what we'll see sometimes is a private donor will come to the university and they'll say, we want to give you money and we want you to give this money to an African American woman who is studying medicine. That's what we want to do. And we say, well, we can't give money. We can't create a program that's going to just give money to an African American woman who's studying medicine or a Latino man who's studying nursing or whatever it is that they've come up with. So we say, well, what if we can try to look at some of these other factors? So we might go to some of these other ideas that I talked about. What if we said we're going to give the money based on membership in a particular student organization? What if we said we're going to give money based on interests in particular health disparities issues? What if we said we're going to do something like that? And in some cases, the outside donor will say, okay, those other factors work, we'll substitute those other factors and we go forward and we do that. In some cases, the donors will say, no, that's not what I want. I want to make sure that my money goes to a Latino man who is studying nursing. That's my primary goal. And it's great that you could come up with some high school that has a lot of Latino students at it or whatever, but that's not my mission. I don't have an association with that high school. I'm not trying to support that high school. I want to support this particular group. So what we do in that case is we do something called the pool and match method. So we can accept that award, that donation, as long as the donor understands that we are going to administer that program in a way that will be race neutral, sex neutral, ethnicity neutral. And this is how we do that. This is like the most difficult, I think, example that I give, so hopefully it'll make sense. So let's say we have, I'm going to be a much smaller number now in the medical school class. Let's say we have 100 students in the medical school, and we look through and we're trying to decide how much money are we going to give to each of those students. And so we decide this student's going to get $10,000, and this student's going to get $20,000, and this student's going to get $5,000, and we go through all of that, right? At the end, after we've spent all of our money and divided it up among all of these students, we go through and we say, do we have any private donation accounts or any other specialized accounts from which we could draw some of this money? So we go through and we say, oh, student 3, who we had decided to award $5,000 to, happens to be, sorry, I said medical school, so we'll have to make it that example, an African American woman who's studying medicine. We say, okay, well, we had this donation from somebody who wanted to give to an African American woman studying medicine. That person was actually willing to give enough money to allow a $10,000 scholarship, but we had decided that student 3 was only eligible for $5,000. So we'll give her the $5,000 that we had said she was eligible for, which frees up $5,000 of our money, and we can redistribute it among all of our 100 students, okay? So what does that mean? That means that student 3 did not get any more money than she would otherwise have gotten if we did not have that private scholarship given. So in terms of helping that actual student, it doesn't actually change their, their financial award. It doesn't necessarily create any additional recruitment effect, so I just want to be very upfront about that. In terms of the donor might feel satisfied in knowing that, yes, my money went to exactly the person to whom I would like it to go. In terms of us, it might make us feel good because we're creating an opportunity to redistribute funds, because anytime that happens, right, there's more money that goes back into the general pool, so that applicant 3 might wind up getting a few more dollars than she would have gotten, just like every other applicant might wind up getting a few more dollars than they would have gotten. But she's not going to get $10,000. She's not going to get $15,000. So it's kind of a, some people really like this, but some people like me think that it has some diminished utility in a lot of respects. But it is something that we can do to work with our donors. Things that we can't do, again, we can't administer privately funded financial aid awards in a way that would give preferential treatment on the basis of race, ethnicity, sex. We can't do that in the context of our university-funded awards as well, obviously. We can't consider race, ethnicity, or sex directly in making any of our awards decisions. So this is all straight from Prop 2 and straight from the discussion that preceded Prop 2. There was a lot of discussion about what Prop 2 meant for admissions among the voters before the amendment passed. There was a lot of discussion about financial aid. There was less discussion about the next topic that I was going to address, which is outreach and recruitment programs. So for outreach and recruitment programs, again, there are lots of things that we can do in trying to set these up. One of the first things that we can do is, as you might imagine, post-Prop 2, we had to go back and look at a lot of the programs that we already had here at the university that maybe did consider race or ethnicity or sex as one of many factors in an individualized, holistic way, which was consistent with Grutter and Gratz, and then decide how are we going to revise those programs post-Prop 2 to make sure that they would be compliant with that proposal as well. So what we could do is we could talk about, even now today, we can talk about why did we create this program in the first place? So we can say the Women in Science and Engineering program was originally created to try to encourage women to pursue studies in science and engineering because of the underrepresentation that typically occurs for that gender in those fields and those areas of study. We don't have to pretend that that's not the case. We don't have to pretend that that wasn't a motivating factor behind our decision-making to create the program. We don't have to pretend that we no longer think of that as an important goal. We can say, and we still strive to promote the participation of women in science and engineering. And then here's the Prop 2 compliant part, but our programs are open to all, right? So you talk about what it is that you're trying to achieve, you talk about why you created this program in the first place, and then you say, but we're not going to be making that distinction on the basis of race or ethnicity or sex anymore because we do have to still comply with our legal obligations here. Now, that doesn't mean that we then have to just say, okay, so that means everyone is equally eligible and that's it. We could still have other kinds of factors that we look at to try to make distinctions between the applicants for our programs, which are very well respected, very important, very useful to students not only who seek to come to U of M, but just in preparing them for college anywhere, right? So thinking about some things from Ross, for example, Ross has this program called the Up Close Academy. And they still say on their website, I believe, that they were originally created to encourage the participation of underrepresented minorities in business. And so the program used to be focused particularly on those who are from underrepresented minority groups. It's now open beyond that group. And what they say is, though, if you want to be a participant in the Ross Up Close Academy, you need to do an essay, to write an essay that explains what diversity means to you, how you would contribute to diversity, why do you think diversity in the business professions would be important, what do you think the benefits are, and that's something that you have to do. Similarly, here, the Michigan Health Sciences Pre-College Exposure Academy, it's open to all students. The website makes that clear that it's open to all students. But what it tries to do is attract students who have an interest in addressing health disparities. And so, again, health disparities tend to affect underrepresented populations and disadvantaged populations. That doesn't mean that only people from those populations would be interested in addressing those disparities. But what you do is you get a group of people together who have said that they care about this issue and they want to learn more about it or do more to address it. And that's what we're trying to achieve through these various programs. So, what can't we do in outreach and recruitment areas? We've said that we can't actually make distinctions, again, on the basis of race, ethnicity, or sex in deciding who would be eligible for a particular program. And so we can't consider those factors when we're actually selecting the participants for a program. And another thing that we can't do, which people don't always think about, is we can't really differentiate in how we alert people to the existence of the program. So what sometimes you'll hear people talk about is this idea of, well, we're going to make the program open to everybody, and we'll put it on our website that it's open to everybody, but then I'm going to send a personal letter to only the African American students at this middle school to encourage those students to apply. Which means that if you're not an African American student at that middle school, you may not ever hear about that program unless you happen to go to the website and you happen to click on the right links to get to the page that will tell you about this program that exists, that technically you're eligible for, but by the time you found out about it, all the spaces have been filled by the people who got the personalized invitation. So we make this distinction where we say we can't really distinguish between groups in deciding whether we're going to passively recruit them or actively recruit them. What we could do, though, is we could go to schools that we say are demographically diverse, and we could say, principal of those schools, we would like you to tell all of your students about this opportunity that we have. And we can pick the schools that we're reaching out to on the basis of their demographics, on the basis of their location in particular areas that we want to build a partnership with, places where we see that we have a lot of good applicants coming from, or even places where we don't see a lot of good applicants, but we think we can do something to help improve the educational experiences of the students. So for example, we might say we want to build a partnership with schools in Detroit or schools in Chicago or schools wherever, because we think that that's something that we can do to help effectuate change, to help build that pipeline. And then we can say, anyone from those schools will be eligible to come. Now, did we know that those schools had demographics of a particular nature when we chose them? Yes, we did know that. But we also knew that there was an educational justification behind our thinking in building that relationship and building the qualifications and the experiences of those students, and then hopefully in turn improving the pipeline, not just for us, but for other institutions as well. The last topic I think that I was going to cover is faculty and staff hiring. So this is a different kind of area. And a lot of what I've said before is tweaked at least a little bit in the context of employment. And so I just want to be very sure that we are clear about the distinction. So in Proposal 2, it's actually longer than the sections that I listed before. It's, I think, 10 or so sections long. And one of the sections in Prop 2 relates to federal programs. And so what that section says is that even if something would ordinarily violate Prop 2, you can still do it if you have to do it to establish or maintain eligibility for a federal program, such that failing to do it would result in a loss of funds to the state. What that means is we are still subject to things like Executive Order 11246. Don't worry, there's no test on the numbers of any of the things I say today, but we're still subject to that executive order, which it requires federal contractors to be affirmative action employers. So you probably have seen in all of our job postings that we still say that we are an equal opportunity affirmative action employer. And you will not be surprised to hear that there were many people outside of the university who, when Prop 2 passed, went into an outrage when they would see that statement, and they'd come in and they'd say, why is this happening, and aren't you violating the law, and didn't we just pass a law that says this? Well, we're not violating the law. The law allows us to do that, and I know Larita Thomas had written a memo to try to explain that to people internally, but also externally, so they would understand that we are still required to be an affirmative action employer, and we are required to state that we are an affirmative action employer in our job postings. Now, we don't have to just state the language that is required by the executive order. If we really want to try to build a sense of diversity and show our commitment to diversity and to equity and inclusion, we can go beyond that statement in our job postings to try to ensure that people see the university as a place that's committed to those issues and those values, and that sees the university as a place that is actually welcoming of applicants of all backgrounds. And so we can go beyond that statement and talk in our job postings about the university's commitment to diversity and how we see diversity as a key component to our performance excellence. Again, sort of underscoring the points that we've been hearing all today about how diversity and excellence are not two different things, but that they actually feed one another, right? So we can go beyond that and talk about our commitment to diversity, and again, through that alone, signal to prospective applicants that we are interested in building a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment here. We can also talk about our desire to encourage applications from all individuals, including members of underrepresented groups. So we can state that in our our job postings when we're trying to encourage applications here on campus and at the Academic Health Center, obviously, as well. We also can take steps to diversify our applicant pools with respect to race, ethnicity, sex, or other characteristics. And I know, I think Marge Cataldo spoke about that in the context of nursing. So participating in targeted recruitment fairs is something that we can do. We can advertise our postings in places that we know have targeted constituencies. So we can try to build the diversity of our applicant pool through that mechanism. Now, in some cases, we are required by federal law to do those things. So in some places, we are viewed as being underrepresented on the basis of a particular race or on the basis of sex, and so we are required by federal law to actually set hiring goals. This is the one time that we can actually clearly quantify a hiring goal without being viewed as creating an illicit quota. So under our federal affirmative action obligations, we have to look at our different job categories, compare each job category to the relevant labor pool for that category, and look at our racial breakdown and look at our gender breakdown. We also have to do this for disability and for veteran status. I just want to note that the federal affirmative action obligations extend to those areas as well. And if we see that we're underrepresented, then we have to set a hiring goal. And if we have a hiring goal for a particular job category, what the executive order requires us to do is to take steps to diversify our applicant pool. Unfortunately, that's the only thing, the only tool that the federal government really gives us when we have a hiring goal, is to diversify the pool itself. But the important thing to note really here is whether we have a hiring goal or not, we always can try to diversify our pool. So all the steps that we've been talking about that you've heard about earlier today in terms of trying to encourage people to apply, in terms of going to different recruitment fairs, all of those things are things that we can do as part of our overall efforts to encourage applications for our positions. What we also can do is actually, when we get our applicant pool together, and we're actually going to go through and evaluate the applicants, we can take into account some of the issues that we've been hearing about today, right? So first of all, we can make sure that the people who are evaluating the applicants have been through unconscious bias training or some other kinds of training that will help them understand how they could be implicitly and unknowingly making determinations about individuals based on their gender or based on the name written on the resume, as opposed to based on the information that's actually being presented. What we also can do is actually think about when we're posting our positions, we can talk about our commitment to diversity, but we can also say, one of the things that we're going to think about when we're evaluating you as an applicant is, what is your commitment to diversity? What have you done to show that these values of diversity, equity, and inclusion are important to you in what you're doing? And this can be true for any position for which we're hiring, right? I mean, when you think about it in the healthcare professions, obviously there's a patient care component to that. For researchers, there could be a research component that is important. But for faculty in general, for staff members, all of us can show our commitment to diversity in some manner or another, whether through our professional experience, through our volunteer experience, or through a combination of those things. And we can ask people about that, and we can actually look at their answers when we're making our assessments of whom to hire down the road. What we can't do, of course, is think about their race when we're actually, or their ethnicity or their sex, when we're actually making the hiring decision. And what I want to stress is that this was true even before Proposal 2 passed. Under Title VII, we were not allowed to say, these two people seem about the same, but this one is a Latina woman, so we're going to hire her. We were never allowed to do that. But we could look at these two people and say, you know what, we're going to look at them and see what have they done to show that they would be instrumental in helping to build the understanding needed for a diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. And we can't say, oh, this person is from an underrepresented group, therefore they must know about that, they must care about that. We can't make that assessment or that, that split-second judgment. But we can ask both of them to tell us, what is it that you would do? And then evaluate to see which answer makes more sense to us. Which person seems to have the commitment that we really want to see? Who seems like they really are going to be interested in mentoring diverse individuals or providing patient care in a way that is not biased by the difference between the patients and themselves. But I think from what Howard was showing us before, we also have to be careful because it seems like even when two people seem to be exactly the same and they say exactly the same thing, there's one person who will be judged as being more likely to be able to mentor diverse individuals and one person who's judged as less likely. And the real reason for that is not necessarily known, which is why it is so important for us to make sure that we have that training first on implicit bias, and we continue to do that. So a lot of units do require for there to be some discussion and consideration of that kind of training before people are involved in their searches. So that was it for my presentation. I wanted to give people time to have questions if there were any. But I do want to stress that going forward, people should feel free to contact me in the General Counsel's office or any of my colleagues so that we can try to work with you as you develop your plans to achieve the diversity, equity, and inclusion that you are looking for.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Michael McKee. I'm with the Department of Family Medicine. This is both a comment and also a question for you. So one of the areas that is often overlooked is people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. And this really needs to be one that needs to be addressed and brought up often. I mean, you can obviously look in our campus, we're underrepresented in both the University of Michigan and also in the medical school. So I just wanted to encourage that maybe in the future topic to touch on that. And I'm just curious to hear from you in terms of discussions related with people with disabilities. Can you give us a little bit, clarity about what's been done, what efforts been done for that group?
So thank you for mentioning it. As I said at the beginning, I was only focusing on a few topics because they were all covered by the same law, but it is true that the larger document that I referenced does address disability and things that we can do and things that we can't do. I haven't seen a lot of plans yet that address, I haven't seen a lot of plans yet, period. So what I've seen so far when people are talking about disability has tended to be in the area of like website accessibility and things like that, as opposed to physical access. But obviously we are obligated under the Americans with Disabilities Act to address both of those kinds of issues. There has been discussion, I think, in some of the plans that I've seen or in some of the consultations that I've had with some units about addressing certain kinds of cognitive issues and mental health issues that might rise to the level of a disability in some cases. But it hasn't really been the focus of a lot of the questions that I've seen up until now. But I really appreciate that you raised it because I think that is something that we need to build into our planning process. And I think, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think at one of the earlier unit lead meetings, there was some discussion about how rather than thinking about this just in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we should also add accessibility. And actually the originator of that idea, Katie Bauer, who's in the Digital Education and Innovation Office here at the university, she said we could call it IDEA as opposed to DE&I, and think about the ideas that we're trying to achieve as opposed to just limiting it in those 3 ways.
Just one question back.
Hi, thank you. I know you mentioned the ability to ask kind of optionally about sex, gender, ethnicity, other on the student application side, or at least I believe that's what I heard from you. But for faculty applications, I saw that that was something that you couldn't ask. And is that just if it's not optional on our application, or is it something we're not allowed to ask in faculty recruitment?
So my understanding is that on the hiring side, that is all done separately through HR and the Office for Institutional Equity. So the question still gets asked, it still is optional, but we don't have the individual units asking about that information. It instead goes through a centralized process. If that's wrong, the Rita can correct me, or someone can correct me. And I think part of that is to discourage the appearance of having considered an inappropriate factor in making a hiring decision. So there's state law. For disability status, for example, we are precluded under the ADA from making a pre-employment inquiry about disability status. We're not allowed to ask that question at all. Well, thank you again for having me, and please do feel free to ask any questions as you go forward and you're developing your plans. Thanks.
Thank you, Maya. And if some of you have other questions for Maya, she, I believe, is the white card that you can fill out, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Maya's great about getting back to people very quickly. We have one more story that we'd like to share, and right after the story, we're going to have Howard Ross come back up. He doesn't need another introduction.
So, as a man in nursing for many years, I've been subtly marginalized and excluded on many occasions. Time after time, I've gotten the clear message that, as a man, I was intruding on a club meant just for women. I once witnessed a nursing director, over a period of several years, mentor and coach female supervisors and managers while ignoring new male nursing managers who needed that coaching just as much. Sadly, this sexism hasn't gotten better over the years, and I have not felt comfortable bringing it up as I fear a backlash. This is why I'm submitting this anonymously. If you change the genders of this story, it would be seen as an outrage. We should be equally concerned that men in nursing continue to be marginalized, excluded, and discriminated against by their colleagues and leadership.